My name is Gary Johnstone. I'm a Master Gardener. I was the class of 2016. And today we're going to be talking about composting. And we'll talk about the benefits of composting. Also, we'll talk a little bit about what compost is. And then we'll talk about the how to make compost. The first thing I want to talk about discussion is the benefits of using compost. I went through a specialty class after I graduated in 2016 in San Antonio on given by Texas Master Gardeners on composting. And one of the things that we talked about is the benefits of compost. It's more than fertilizer, it's more than a soil conditioning, but it's also one of the ways that you can recycle your the waste of your household or your community in recycling it back into the garden. And for an organic gardener, it's probably the single most important thing that you can do to be an organic gardener is to use compost to prepare your soil for whatever type of planting you're going to do. Myself, I do mostly native plants, perennials, and then I have a vegetable garden that I use compost in. The physical benefits of composting, as it says here, it loosens the compacted soil. And around here, if you live in this area, our soils are heavily clay. What soil there is. Most of it is limestone based, and the soil that we have is very high very high pH, very alkaline, and it's has a lot of clay in it. So what compost does is it helps the soils bind the moisture that we get either by rain or by your watering. It holds that moisture in the soil with the organic matter. It also helps the soil to be worked. When you're first planting soil, and I'll show you some demonstrations of soil that hasn't been treated with compost and those that have, but it makes the soil much more adaptable and for planting new plants and seeds. It also helps with erosion because, as we talked about, it helps bind the particles of the soil, whether it's sandy soil or clay soil. It helps it from, it holds it together and prevents erosion. I want to talk about what happens, this video that I took out at the AgriLife. This is soil that has not been worked with compost. It was worked with compost last planting season, but cucumbers were grown in this raised bed. And as you can see, it made the soil very clumpy, hard to work, hard to plant in. This is soil that I took a picture of that they had worked mushroom compost into the soil at the AgriLife Center. And you can see the difference between the two types of soil. The soil is looser, the clumps are smaller. It's ready for planting. The organic matter in the soil that's added with the compost really acts as a sponge it corrects the soil that, as I said, we have most of our area has clay-based soil, and it helps that soil, allowing it to be formed into aggregates small enough for plants to use. It also, the microorganisms holding the moisture in the soil allows the plant roots to take up that moisture rather than the moisture just running out of the soil. So what is compost? Well, it's decomposed organic matter. And it decomposes through microorganisms active in the soil. And it's made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water, or moisture. When you have a compost pile, there's 4 different principal microorganisms that work on the decomposition. The one is bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and protozoa. Bacteria is predominantly most prevalent in compost, organic matter that's being decomposed. But compost serves as a vehicle for nutrients. As you can see in these pictures, the microorganisms are microscopic, but they perform an interaction with the plants to deliver the nutrients to the root fibers of the plant. And also the moisture that's held in the soil with the help of the compost provides that moisture to the roots of the plants. When you have a compost pile, the microorganisms are really the heart of the compost pile. You start out with the raw materials, which is the organic matter, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it includes carbon, which is an energy, and proteins and nitrogen, traces of nitrogen. Not most your organic matter that you introduce has small amounts of nitrogen. Mostly it's carbon. You also introducing minerals, trace minerals that plants need to be healthy. Once you have finished compost, you have the chemical energy of carbon, nitrogen, and protein, as well as those minerals that are provided by the microorganisms. So to have a good compost pile, you need moisture, you need air, and that 2 things plus the raw material that you're putting into the pile feeds the microorganisms so that they can decompose the material that you're adding. These microbes need carbon, they need nitrogen, they need protein, they need moisture, they need oxygen, and those things produce, as they decompose, produce heat, which is also something that the microbes need to do their work, to decompose. As I was saying, bacteria is the predominant microorganisms in a compost pile. It does 80 to 90% of the decomposition, and it creates the heat in the compost pile. Acetylmides are also a bacteria. It gives the compost the earthy smell or the soil smell in it. It looks a little different than most bacteria. It has these filaments or web that it creates in the compost pile, but it's the microorganisms that's needed to break down the paper, the cardboard, the bark, the small woody stems. If you see cardboard stored where it's been moisture, this microorganisms will grow on the surface of cardboard or paper. Fungi doesn't create heat, but it breaks down organic debris that's tougher. Some of your bark and some of the thicker materials that are in your compost pile, the fungi breaks those down, can decompose it. It's usually, as I said, it doesn't create heat, and it's predominantly in the outer areas of your compost pile. Protozoa and rotifers, they're not there's not a lot of that prevalent in your compost, but it does a role in decomposition. They also have another role, is that they can eliminate some of the bacteria and fungi that you don't want in your compost pile. Okay, one of the things that people may not understand is that the decomposition is not like crumbling. What happens is the microbes secrete an enzyme which surrounds the particles that you're putting in the compost pile, and it dissolves from the outside. And that's why we'll talk more about how important the particle size is, because the enzymes working on the outside of the matter, organic matter, the size of the particles does make a difference. We'll talk about hot and cold composting, but when you create a compost pile, the compost pile is going to generate heat if it's prepared or if it's layered properly. You're going to get, in a compost pile of say 3 or 4 feet in size, you're going to get temperature in the center of the compost pile up above 100 degrees fairly quickly, even in the winter. You can, in the summertime, you can see the insides of a compost pile get up to 150, 160 degrees. But you should see the heat in the compost pile get over 100 degrees fairly quickly, in 2 or 3 days, if it's layered and put together properly. We talked about it. What is compost? It's decomposition of organic matter through microorganism activities. And to do that, they need carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, some moisture, and it's important as to the carbon-nitrogen ratio in the pile. And what carbon material that you need to add? This is some of them. This isn't all of them. And they all have a different carbon to nitrogen ratio. Leaves are something that a lot of people have a lot of. if they're live oak leaves, they take a long time to decompose. Other softer leaves off of some other trees, they'll decompose fairly quickly. I would say within months if you're not working the compost. Sawdust is, if you're using sawdust of wood that has not been treated, you're getting a lot of carbon energy in your compost pile, but you don't want to overdo it because it'll distort the carbon nitrogen ratio. Hay and cardboard are good carbon energy materials. Their carbon nitrogen ratio is more in line with 1 to 30, 1 to 40, where sawdust is 1 to 200 to 300. So if you're putting together a compost pile, if you use sawdust, use it sparingly unless you have a lot of green material. Now, green material or nitrogen material, some of your manures, some animal manures are okay. Also alfalfa hay, blood meal, those are high protein sources, also provides more nitrogen than some of the leaves and other hays. This is a chart that is in one of our books the Master Gardeners have. And what you're looking at is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And just looking at some of these things. Fresh cow manure or horse manure is in the range of 20% carbon, 1% or less nitrogen. And most of the finished compost that you'll get, the carbon to nitrogen ratio will be somewhere in the 20 to 1 ratio. So you get over here in vegetable waste, like when you throw out leafy lettuce or other leafy vegetables into your compost pile, you're getting 10% carbon and 1% nitrogen. So you're getting a little more. Any fresh greens, you're going to get more nitrogen and less carbon. So, and if your goal is to get a nitrogen, a carbon ratio of about 20% to 30% carbon, and 1 to 2% or at least 1% nitrogen in the compost pile. So you have a lot of brown material. You have newspaper and cardboard that's dry is 40 to 0.1 nitrogen, so it's high in carbon. Wood chips, sawdust. This one showing sawdust is 50 to 0.1. Some sawdust, depending on what wood it is, can go up to 200 to 300% carbon. So you're looking for a carbon to nitrogen ratio, ideally in finished compost of 20 to 35 to 1. The greener material, if it's wet or fresh, you're going to get more nitrogen and it's going to decompose much faster. Your nitrogen material will decompose much faster than your carbon material. So as you add more green material to your compost pile. If you still have carbon material or brown material that's not decomposed, you can keep adding the green material to your compost pile. Okay, we'll talk about oxygen and water. When you have a 40 to 50% moisture content in your compost pile, then you're going to get decomposition. If it's too high, it's going to get smelly and it won't decompose. It'll just turn to a smelly pile. If it's too dry, then you're not going to get any decomposition. And there's several ways you can use meters to identify your moisture content. But if you take a shovel and get some of the compost, some of the organic matter out of your compost pile, and you can tell by squeezing it if it's moist. But if water is dripping out of it, then it's too wet. And what you can do if it's too wet or too dry, if it's too wet, you need to turn it or mix it up, fluff it or whatever, so that more oxygen gets into and that will help dry it out. If it's too dry, of course, use a water hose. If we're not getting any rain, you may have to add water to it once a week just to get the moisture content up. Particle size. This takes a little work if you get material like twigs, or let's say you pull up a tomato plant out of your garden at the end of the planting period and you throw it into the compost pile. That's probably too big. You should chop it up into smaller pieces. One technique that I've used at the AgriLife Center is I have a bagging lawnmower that I take to the AgriLife Center, and when they pull plants up, I just run over it with the lawnmower and chop it up, and that gets the particle size down to a small particle size that can decompose fairly quickly. You can also just use a shovel and cut up the stems off a plant to make them smaller. Of course, the leaves on the plants are gonna decompose pretty fast. If you have paper, you have large pieces of cardboard, tear it into smaller pieces, somehow shred it, whatever, and to get it into smaller pieces so that it can decompose faster. Otherwise, it'll decompose eventually. Okay, I was going to look to see, is there any questions so far? Let me see where, I forgot where the chat is.
Hey, Gary, your chat should be in the lower center part of your screen.
Okay, we got 5 questions. Okay, you answered that one on recording. Okay, somebody asked about, is there an increase in rodents or animals in your yard or garden as opposed to using commercial products. If you keep the compost pile from getting anaerobic and smelling, as long as when you throw kitchen waste into your compost pile, try to cover it up with some brown material, maybe some leaves or something on top of it, so that it doesn't create a smell that attracts the rodents in your neighborhood. Cardboard pieces, if it's cardboard like the boxes that you get shipped to you, the thicker cardboard, I would say break it down into 6 to 10 inches squares. But if it's cardboard that's not very thick, I don't think you need to do any more than maybe break it down to 12 inches or 20-inch pieces. It will break down. Cedar, so a lot of cedar bad for compost. Cedar is like a lot of other, I guess you're talking about cedar stems or cedar, cedar we have, the mountain cedar we have around here. It will take longer to decompose unless you unless it's very small stems or, but if you take like a 1-inch round sapling that you cut down, it will take a long time. I would say maybe a year for that to decompose in a compost pile. I haven't included any in mine. But I know the AgriLife, the recycling center, when they chop up their trees and limbs that they get into their size, I know people that use that to create soil on their land, and it will decompose, but it could be a year, could be more before that decomposes. Okay, on weeds. My thinking on weeds is when weeds first come up, they don't have any blooms, they don't have any seeds, they're okay to compost. But if you have weeds that have gone to flower and they have seeds in them, when they flower, they have pollen and seeds in them, then you don't want those weeds in your compost pile, because they won't, unless you can really get your compost up to the 150 degrees, those seeds are going to go right back into your garden, and you're going to have more weeds to pull than you would otherwise. I think that's the last question I have. I did want to remind everyone, if you haven't heard, that the Comal Master Gardeners is having a plant sale Saturday and Sunday. It's online, it's not in person. You can go to this website that's on the screen, comalmg.org, and there is a list of the plants, varieties that they have for sale. And they're priced by the size of the container. There's lots of 4-inch plants. There's some plants that are in 1 gallon, and there's a few plants that are in larger 3-gallon containers, and they're priced according to the container. It's online. It starts Saturday at 9 in the morning and it ends Sunday at 5 p.m. And then your plants that you purchase need to be picked up on Monday between 8 and 1 p.m. on the 26th of April. Just wanted to make that plug. I went over there today and was unloading plants, and There is definitely over 1,000 plants at the AgriLife classroom that are going to be for sale. And on Monday, the plants that didn't sell online, they will be selling those. And all the sales are credit cards. The sales on Monday, I think they'll take checks and cash on Monday, but online, they're all credit card sales. Okay. We want to talk about making compost. This is the fun part. And it can be easy and it can take a lot of work. So it depends on what you want to do. And it's also something you can get your whole family involved. You can get kids involved. And so I think it's something that families can do together. As I said, it keeps waste out of the landfills, and it's teaching people about recycling. When you're going to make compost, there's 3 things that I think are important. Location, type of bin you're going to use, and also where you're going to get your organic matter or the raw material for your compost. Location. It needs to be convenient, just like your garden. If you don't have your garden in a convenient place, you're probably not going to go to your garden or your compost bin often enough. The best thing is, I've been told many times by gardeners, is the best thing for your garden is your shadow. You should be out there every day. You should be checking on your garden daily. You need to watch out for those worms, watch out for the bugs, watch out for the critters. Let's see what the critters are eating out of your garden. And the same thing with your compost. Your compost pile, you need to periodically check the moisture. You need to have it convenient for you to add material to it. So it's very important. 2 different ways of composting, hot or cold. Cold composting is what most people do. They get a bin or they just create a pile of organic matter in their yard, and and they let it sit, and the microorganisms do their thing, and in 6 months to a year, you have compost for the garden. And that's what a lot of people do. You compost, you prepare your compost for next year's garden, not this year's garden. Now, if you have a lot of energy and want to do hot composting, we'll talk about how to do that. The benefits of cold composting is it doesn't require any more effort than making a pile of your material or filling a container, a bin of some kind. After that, you just let it go. Although I think you should check the moisture. I think if we get into this dry spells, it's good to check the moisture periodically. Hot composting, you can, the benefit is you get more compost out of the organic matter because not as much decomposes or it disappears. And although this picture shows 18 days, I would say that 40 to 60 days is more likely the time it takes to decompose most material. Tools. Okay, on the left, if you're going to do compost, whether you're harvesting it at the end or you're turning it and working the compost, you need these tools. You need some kind of a fork to dig into it and you need a shovel. Two other meters that you can use if you, it's not necessary, but it can be useful, is a moisture meter and a thermometer. And these two that I'm showing here have long stems so that you can reach down into the middle of a 3 or 4 foot compost bin. The other thing you need to harvest is a wheelbarrow and preferably some type of screen or filter to separate the decomposed material from that's not quite finished. And this one that's in this picture is a 1/4 inch hardware cloth in a wood 2x4 frame. And you take a shovel, you throw the compost on the screen. What falls through is small enough particles for using with seed or in the planting seedlings in your garden. If you don't use a screen, you can still use the compost for mulch on top of the soil once it's once the organic matter is decomposed. But these are tools that I've used, and I have used 1/2 inch hardware cloth and 1/4 inch hardware cloth. The 1/4 inch is probably better when if you're going to use compost mixed with seed starting soil. It seems to work. Our greenhouse out at the AgriLife Center uses a mixture of soil and potting soil and compost, and they use the 1/4 inch screen to get their compost fine enough. For the gardens, for when we're mixing soil into the demonstration beds, we generally use a 1/2 inch screen and work that into the garden soil. Okay, if you're going to make compost, you don't need to have a bin. There's options of no bin, but and if you do want to have a bin, just to kind of keep the compost pile into smaller space, you can use some structures, and we'll go over some of the options. Here's an option that you can use, and this is similar to what I do in the walk paths around my garden. I dump the leaves the live oak leaves and other trees leaves. I just dump them in next to the garden and where I'm walking, so that when I'm out in the garden walking and back and forth, that's decomposing. That helps decompose the leaves. So you can just make a trench, or you can just put them next to a raised bed, and use it into a pathway somewhere where you're walking a lot on, so that you're stepping on the leaves helps the decomposition. Structures. This is one of the structures that I've built at schools. I think middle school at Mountain Valley, we built with pallets. You can usually find a place that'll give you pallets. So if you take 4 pallets and either use a heavy duty wire or nails and screws, you can make a compost bin. It's ideal size. The pallets are usually a little over 3 feet, and makes an ideal size for a compost bin. And you can make multiple ones. You can just go attach the next 2 or 3 of them together and use the pallets to tie together. Wire baskets is something that I've used. Here's, it's not a picture of mine, but I have a 1/2-inch hardware cloth wire basket like this, 4 feet high. You take hardware cloth, cut it 10 feet long, and put it into a circle, tie the ends together. You can use these poles, but it's not required. The benefit of the poles is that when you get ready to, if you want to harvest it, or if you want to turn it, you can just grab those poles and get somebody to help you if it's too heavy, and grab the pole, pull it up, and then set it next to the pile, and you can fill it back up again. Here's a picture of the one at the AgriLife Center. This is, I think this is fencing wire. This is that 2x4-inch fencing wire that they've used to layer in. I believe this is layering in leaves, grass clippings, and horse manure is what's in that wire bin. You can purchase wire baskets. This is a purchase one that's that I got a picture of from one of the garden supply places. There's several types of purchased composters. This is one that uses layers, shelves, little boxes that you put the compost in. It has air, so that air can get into because you do need air to flow through your compost. These are tumblers. This is a large one that's out at the AgriLife Center. And then this is a smaller one on the right. These sell for a couple of $100 to $500 for the larger one. Some people have a lot of success using those. If you get a good mixture of material with small particle size and the right carbon nitrogen ratio, you can turn out finished compost in pretty quick. One of the master gardeners in New Braunfels uses one that's similar to the size of the one on the right, and he says he gets finished compost every month out of his. My experience hasn't been too good. When I've used it, the ones at the school that I volunteer at, it tended to get too wet and stay too wet and didn't seem to get enough oxygen into the tumbler, and it kept holding a lot of moisture. But so you just need to make sure when you're using a tumbler that you're aware of what you're putting in and how much moisture it has and how much oxygen you're getting. It helps if you turn it daily. At the school, we only went out to this garden once a week, so that may have been part of the problem, is that it wasn't turned but once a week. You do need to regularly, daily turn these things to keep oxygen flowing into the structure. One of the builds that I did at Bill Brown Elementary is a 3-bin structure like this. There's on Texas A&M website, there's actually instructions on how to build this particular one. They give you the material list, they give you the cuttings, the cut list, and instructions on how to put it together. basically what you're doing is that you're making 3 bins where you can, the theory is you can start out on the bin on the left with your material, you let it sit for a while, and then after it started decomposing, you remove these slats in the front, you move the material to the second bin, and then it decomposes, you let it sit for a while. And then by the time you turn it to the third bin, you should be ready to harvest your compost material for your garden. So if you want to build your own, as I said, on Texas A&M horticulture or Aggie horticulture website, there is a building plan for this type of bin. It uses 1/2-inch hardware cloth on the back and the sides of each bin. And then the front, these are cut slats that can be moved and raised out of the bin. So you have access to it by the front. You can also use a single bin. This one is all wood. And as you see, they left air supply, they left airflow in their construction. That's very important. Now, composting methods. The people have been composting for hundreds of years, thousands of years. This indoor method they've found has been used by farming for in countries and on farms in the United States for a long time. Basically, what the farmer does is he takes material out of the fields and piles it up, adds a layer of manure and soil on top of the organic matter. So you start out with the rough brush. Excuse me, didn't know that wasn't turned off. You start out with the brush in your, and then you add the manure and the soil, and you keep layering up. And the taller and wider you make it, the more heat you're going to generate and the more compost you're going to end up with. Another method similar to that, the only difference is that this biodynamic method, which acts a little bit faster, they use a layer of lime or rock powder in addition to the organic matter, the manure and the soil into it. And then it's covered with soil. That holds in the moisture, holds in the heat, and has proven to work very well. One that was done at University of California in a study that was done by their agriculture university college. This is similar to the other methods, except it's contained in a bin. This is a 4-foot high layered compost pile. Again, with soil, organic matter, and manures that are layered in. Their study showed using this method, and then after the decomposition started, turning it to a separate bin. They used the 3-bin method that we mentioned a while ago. They were able to produce finished compost in 18 days. I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to do that. I haven't ever been able to do that quickly. Just want to show you the first compost pile I put together in 2016 after my class at the AgriLife Center. So that is a 4-foot wide by 4-foot high bin. We put that together and I measured the temperature Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of each week. And we turned it 9 times, turned it between bins, like they mentioned in the study at UCal. And in the second time we measured it, it had jumped from 80 degrees to 160. This was in July, so it was a hot, the temperature outside was very hot. Every time we turned it, we measured. The next time we were out at the garden, we measured the temperature. And as you can see, over time, the temperature came down after turning it several days. In our class, they talked about once your temperature in your compost pile moderates to about 100 degrees, then it goes into a curing phase and it should return to the original temperature or the air temperature. And in this case, the air temperature in the morning in July and August was about 80 degrees. So that's what we ended up saying that our compost was finished, was when it returned to and that was 100 days. So as I said, you can expect compost, but you're making compost for the next time you plant, not the current time. This was a second attempt we did after the first attempt, and we had a little bit different outcome, but still it entered a curing phase and it stayed. It never really got down to the 80 degrees that we expected. It stayed pretty warm in the compost pile. So we took it out. Once you think it's finished, if it's you can tell by the particle size that it has decomposed. And if the compost pile is still hot, the best thing you do is to take it out and spread it and let it cool before you plant. Anytime you're planting where you've used compost, if it's hot, you want it to, the soil to be near the air temperature in that period, in that day, that time of the year. Because if it's really hot, then you put seedlings in the ground, you're just going to kill the roots in the plant. Okay, let's see. I want to check, see if there's any additional. Got one more question. Okay, I did mention about cedar. Cedar, any wood chips that you put in your compost pile will eventually decompose, whatever wood type they are. The larger the particles or the chip, the longer it's going to take. But you can use wood chips. You can use any kind of shredded materials in your compost pile, and it will decompose. It just takes longer the larger the particle size. Whether it's better to be in the sun or the shade, really your moisture is going to be easier to control if it's not in the direct sun all day long. Mine is most of mine are either in the shade or partial shade. They may get some sun on them, but the one at the AgriLife Center is directly in the sun all day. And we do have to add water to it weekly to keep it moist, because the sun will bake the moisture out of the compost pile. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is putting together a compost pile. Any way, any type of container are not contained, just making a pile on your land. This is the way you get a compost pile started. You do the organic matter, you add some type of fertilizer, some manure, or if you want to use lawn fertilizer is okay, depending on if you're want to be totally organic or not, but you can use any type of fertilizer. And then you need to add a layer of soil. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. Native soil works just fine. All you're doing in the soil is you're taking the microorganisms that are in our native soil and putting them in your compost pile. The fertilizer and the organic matter is going to feed those microorganisms. You don't need to, as the professor A&M said in our class, you don't need to go buy a compost starter. Compost starter is basically microorganisms that they are putting in the compost starter. There's millions and millions of microorganisms in our soil, in all the soil, and you do not need to add more microorganisms. You just need to feed the microorganisms that are in the soil so that they have something to decompose. And the fertilizer just stimulates the microorganisms, but they're going to feed off of the organic matter in your compost pile. Now, we're going to talk about what you're going to use compost for. As I said, you don't have to, when you have a compost pile and you can tell that it's decomposing, but it's not down to the 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch size material, you can still use it. Even partially decomposed material makes very good mulch. It helps with the control of weeds, and also the nutrients that are in your compost pile. Every time you water those plants, or every time it rains, when it rains, it's feeding those microorganisms into the soil. So it is a great mulch, even if you don't get finished fine compost out of your compost pile. It's also great for planting seedlings. If you're going to plant a perennial in your yard, you dig a hole, you put some compost in the hole, mix it into the native soil. You're conditioning that soil. It helps improve the moisture retention capability of the soil, and adding the nutrients that are in that the plant can use once you put it in. So add it to when you're planting. Okay. I have some references. I think they're going to send these out to you later, but these are some of the reference books that I suggest. Now, the Rosedale book of composting is probably not my favorite, but that's the book that they gave us at the class at Texas A&M put on. It has all the information you need to compost. but it's a little hard to use. This one, Garden Success with Difficult Soil. This guy, Scott Ogden, he talks specifically about the soils in Texas, and talks about how the soils that used to be very fertile in our area became difficult, mainly over farming, people not using crop rotation, those type of things that made the soil that we have very difficult. But it's also just the nature of the hill country. This one, this complete compost gardening guide, that is a great book, not just for compost, but for organic gardening. So I would suggest, and all of these books, I believe, are available used. In fact, I think this last one, I went to one of the used book sites online and got it for $4. So some of these may not be available. The Rosedale may not be available. The Gardening Success with Difficult Soils is available. I'm not sure it's new, if there's new print books, but there are used books available. And the library may have a copy of it, I'm not sure. Online resources, the Texas A&M Extension Service has some great research done by their scientists, their professors, and aggieHorticulture.tamu.edu. That should be your site for any, for gardening advice. They also do videos, YouTube videos. Scott Richter, who's a professor at Texas A&M, kind of does a little comedy in his YouTubes, but he has a number of YouTube videos about composting, about gardening, about your lawn, general landscaping. Very good resource for you. Now, the Comal Master Gardeners also has an Ask on our website, which I gave you the website earlier. They have an Ask a Master Gardener program, and you can send questions in on the website, send questions in. They will have somebody research it, one of the Master Gardeners research it, and they will get back to you. You can also, we don't currently have a gardening ag agent right now. They're in the process of interviewing for the ag agent that usually supervises the Master Gardeners program. But they are another resource that you can call them, or you can go by their office on Highway 46 and behind the recycling center, and they can answer questions. Also, I'll give a plug to the 2 books that the Comal Master Gardener have published. We have a gardening guide that's primarily for herbs and landscaping. And then we have a vegetable and herb guide that is geared toward Comal County vegetables. And those 2 books are available at many of your garden stores or nurseries, but they're also available at cost from a Master Gardener or at the Texas A&M or the County AgriLife office, as I said, off 46 behind the recycling center. They're, the gardening guide is $29. Um, the vegetable and garden herb guide is $20 at cost. But if you go to the nurseries, or you can, but they are marking those up to retail price.
I have a question.
Sure.
How much compost would you recommend mixing into like a 10 by 10 garden that you're going to plant in the ground?
What are you going to plant?
Tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and eggplant.
Have you ever added compost to the soil, or is this a new bed you're creating?
It's been there a long time ago and it was productive, and then it was fallow or whatever, neglected, and now replanting it.
2 inches. I add 2 inches every planting season to mine.
Okay.
If it hasn't been, you'll be able to tell if you add a couple of inches and work in. If you're planting tomatoes and peppers, it's not deep root plants. So you don't really need to prepare the soil much more than maybe 4 to 6 inches. So I would work it in. You can work it in by hand, or you can use a cultivator or something else to work it in. But I would work it in. I'm not a tilling person. I don't till gardens unless I'm adding something to it to benefit the soil. And about the only time I do is when I'm getting ready to start a new planting season, is to add the compost and then use a cultivator to work it in like 4 to 6 inches.
Okay, thank you. Do you think tilling is detrimental or
well,
or?
There's a saying that the microorganisms in your soil, they create an environment in the soil that benefits the roots of plants. And just for tilling purposes, you're disturbing that environment that microorganisms in the soil have created, and it will restore itself, but it will take some time to restore that. If you're adding compost, or you're adding, say you need to add more soil because you don't have enough soil in your raised bed, then you want to work that in, but you're adding a benefit to the soil, you're not taking away.
Do you think raised beds are more beneficial or easier to do?
Well, around here, the native soil is only 2 to 3 inches of soil. The native soil in my yard, I'd be lucky if I could scratch 2 to 3 inches before I hit rocks.
Yeah.
And so I use raised beds.
What kind of soil do you start with doing raised beds, and how deep?
Use a garden soil mixed with compost.
When you say garden soil, you mean go to a place that has
you'll need to go to a soil, a rock yard, and ask them for garden soil, not topsoil. Topsoil doesn't have any organic matter in it. And to use topsoil, you'll need to add a lot of organic matter to produce a good vegetable garden.
Kind of off the topic, but what about container plants, like container tomatoes? Do you wash the fertilizer off by constantly watering in container?
Container plants, you need to get a schedule. You need to do slow release fertilizers, because if you use like a lawn fertilizer, or some kind of balanced fertilizer that is fast acting, then you're going to lose the benefit of that fertilizer the more you water the container. Slow release fertilizers are designed to hold some of their fertilizing capabilities as you water.
So it's in the container soil, slow release, as opposed to some sort of spray on.
Yes. There's only a few plants that you can spray the leaves and fertilize the plant. Most plants, you're fertilizing the root system, not the foliage.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm sorry that was off topic.
Oh, that's okay. That's no problem.
As far as raised beds, is it bad to use treated wood?
It's not going to harm your plants. A lot of people use treated wood for raised beds. There is some people that have a concern about the chemicals that are used to treat pine, but as far as I know, there's no the root system does not feed off of the wood; it feeds off of the soil.